February 17th, 1917. The North Atlantic off the coast of southern Ireland. A rusting 3,207-ton collier flying a Norwegian flag drifts alone on open water. She carries no escort, no convoy, no visible weapon. A German U-boat commander watches her through his periscope for the better part of an hour and sees exactly what he expects to see. A slow, unarmed merchantman, an easy kill. He fires one torpedo. It strikes her aft near the engine room. The explosion should have been the end of the story. Instead, within 20 minutes, that same defenseless merchantman opens fire with hidden guns at point-blank range, kills the U-boat's captain with her first shot, and puts 45 shells into the submarine's hull until it goes down. The commander of the merchant ship, still standing on a deck that is visibly sinking beneath him, radios headquarters a message so understated it became naval legend. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for an action in which his own ship was the bait, the target, and the trap all at once. This is the story of the Q ship, the most deceptive vessel the Royal Navy ever put to sea, and the captain who built his tactics around a simple, brutal idea. Let the enemy think you are helpless. By the summer of 1915, Britain faced a problem with no existing solution. German U-boats were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping a month, and the Royal Navy had almost nothing that could catch one. Depth charges did not exist in usable form until 1916. Sonar did not exist at all. A submarine on the surface could outrun most merchant ships and outfight most of them too, since merchantmen carried no weapons whatsoever under international law. A submarine submerged was simply invisible. Convoys, the tactic that would eventually win the war at sea, were rejected by an admiralty that considered them defensive and passive. The only real chance of killing a U-boat was catching it on the surface at close range before it dived. That meant getting a warship close enough to fire without the U-boat realizing it was a warship until it was too late. The idea the Admiralty settled on struck most professional naval officers as close to absurd. Take an ordinary merchant ship, one of the slow, unremarkable tramp steamers that U-boats sank by the dozen without a second thought and hide naval guns aboard her. Crew her with sailors dressed as merchant seamen. Send her out alone, unescorted, looking exactly like the easiest possible target. Wait for a U-boat to surface and attack. Then, and only then, reveal the guns. Critics inside and outside the Navy considered the whole concept a gamble built on theatre rather than firepower. A single miscalculation, a panic party that broke character too early, a gun crew that hesitated, and the merchant ship would simply be sunk with no chance to fight back. Because that is what an unarmed tramp steamer looks like right up until the moment it is not one. The ship at the centre of this story began her life in 1904 as a collier named Lodderer, a nothing special coal carrier with no fixed home port. In 1915, the Admiralty took her over and renamed her HMS Farnborough, designated Q5. Her conversion was a study in deliberate deception rather than raw firepower. She carried 5 12-pounder guns, 2 6-pounders, and a Maxim machine gun, a real but modest arsenal for a warship, concealed entirely behind false deckhouses, a fake hen coop, and gunnels rigged on hinges so they could drop away in seconds to expose the weapons beneath. Her captain was Gordon Campbell, a Royal Navy officer who had grown bored commanding an aging destroyer on ordinary escort duty and volunteered for what the service quietly called Special Service. Campbell drilled his crew relentlessly in the one skill that mattered more than gunnery: acting. When a torpedo struck, a portion of the crew, the so-called panic party, had to abandon ship convincingly, in visible disorder, rowing away in lifeboats, while the U-boat surfaced to finish the job or take prisoners. Meanwhile, a second, hidden crew stayed aboard the sinking ship, lying flat on deck or crouched behind the false structures, waiting for the order to fire. The entire tactic depended on discipline under conditions almost no sailor had trained for, staying still and silent aboard a ship that was, by design, being allowed to sink. Farnborough's first proof of concept came on March 22nd, 1916, off Britain's west coast. U-68 fired a torpedo that narrowly missed her bow. Rather than react, Farnborough held her course and speed exactly as a real merchantman would. The U-boat surfaced roughly 1,000 yards astern, closed to 800 yards, and fired a warning shot across her bow. Farnborough played the part completely. She stopped, vented steam, lowered a boat as if surrendering. Only when the submarine closed to 800 yards did Campbell raise the white ensign and open fire with 3 of his 512-pounders. 21 rounds later, U-68 was going down, and Campbell finished her with a depth charge dropped directly over the wreck as she sank, one of the first successful uses of the weapon in the war. If you're finding this look at the Royal Navy's deception war interesting, subscribing takes a second and helps the channel keep making these. The action that defined Farnborough and that has echoed through naval history since came almost a year later, on February 17th, 1917. Campbell had refined his doctrine to its most extreme form. Rather than waiting to be discovered, he would let his ship absorb a torpedo hit deliberately, to fully convince a U-boat commander that no threat remained. That morning, flying a neutral flag, Farnborough was struck exactly as planned, the torpedo tearing into her engine room bulkhead. The panic party rowed away in full view. U-83's captain, Capitan Lieutenant Bruno Hopper, brought his boat to the surface and closed to within 100 yards of the stricken ship to inspect his kill up close. Campbell held his fire until every gun bore on the target, then gave the order. The first shell reportedly struck the conning tower directly. Of 45 rounds fired at point-blank range, nearly all struck home. U-83 sank with almost her entire crew. Only 2 of Hop's men were pulled alive from oil-thick water, and one of them later died. Farnborough herself was now genuinely sinking, not acting. Campbell destroyed his confidential documents, evacuated all but a handful of key crew, and sent a signal to Vice Admiral Bailey at Queenstown that has been quoted in naval histories ever since for its understatement. Q-5, he reported, was slowly going down and wished the Admiral goodbye. Within the hour, the destroyer Narwhal and the sloop Buttercup arrived and began towing the wreck toward land. Overnight, a depth charge still aboard detonated accidentally, nearly finishing the job the U-boat had started. Campbell's executive officer, Ronald Stewart, disobeyed a direct order to abandon ship, so he could make sure his captain got off safely, an act of quiet insubordination that went unpunished. Farnborough was eventually beached at Mill Cove in County Cork, wrecked beyond further service, but she had done exactly what she was built to do. Campbell was awarded the Victoria Cross for the action, one of the rare citations given for a commander who deliberately allowed his own ship to be torpedoed as part of the plan. 2 of his officers received the Distinguished Service Order, 3 the Distinguished Service Cross, and 7 of his crew the Distinguished Service Medal, with the rest mentioned in dispatches. £1,000 in prize money was shared among the men who had spent 20 minutes lying motionless on a sinking deck, waiting for an order to reveal themselves. Campbell would go on to command 2 further Q ships and was twice more put forward for the Victoria Cross, a recognition he declined both times in favour of letting his crews draw for the honour by ballot instead. Set against the full Q ship campaign, Farnborough's record looks almost improbable. Across roughly 200 Q ships fielded by Britain over the course of the war, and about 150 recorded engagements, the entire programme is credited with sinking somewhere around 14 U-boats, under 10% of all German submarines lost in the war, a return that ordinary minefields comfortably outperformed. 27 Q ships were lost in the trade. By any strictly numerical measure, the Admiralty's post-war assessment was blunt. The programme had tied up skilled crews and resources without sinking enough submarines to justify itself. And yet, within that unimpressive campaign total, a single ship under a single captain accounted for 2 confirmed kills and became the most decorated small ship action of the entire underwater war. The tactic that looked marginal in aggregate was, in the hands of the right crew, close to unbeatable. The reason the wider campaign faded matters as much as the reason Farnborough succeeded. Q ships worked only as long as U-boat captains trusted the surface picture in front of them. Once German commanders learned that ordinary-looking merchantmen might be armed traps, and once unrestricted submarine warfare resumed in 1917, U-boats increasingly torpedoed targets while still submerged, without ever surfacing to inspect a kill, removing the one window in which a Q ship's disguise could pay off. The tactic that depended entirely on deception collapsed the moment the enemy stopped extending the courtesy of getting close enough to look. When the Admiralty tried reviving Q ships in 1940, 2 of them were torpedoed and sunk without ever sighting the U-boats that killed them, and the rest were quietly paid off within a year, having accomplished nothing. The trick that worked brilliantly in 1917 simply did not work again once submarine doctrine had adapted around it. What survived was not the tactic. It was the proof that appearances can be engineered as deliberately as armour plating or gun elevation. Farnborough carried no more firepower than any number of small escort vessels of her era. Her 12-pounders were unremarkable guns on an unremarkable hull. What made her lethal was invisible on any specification sheet. A captain willing to let his own ship absorb a torpedo as bait. A crew disciplined enough to lie motionless on a visibly sinking deck without braking. And a doctrine built entirely around making the enemy believe exactly what he wanted to believe until it killed him. The Admiralty's assessment of the wider Q-ship programme was correct on the numbers. It missed the point of the ship that mattered most. A tramp steamer with a coal-fired past and no fixed home port, disguised as the easiest target on the ocean, sank 2 U-boats and earned her captain the Victoria Cross, because the most dangerous thing in the North Atlantic in February 1917 was not the ship with the biggest guns. It was the ship that looked like it had none at all.